Hey, this is Miss Harris with part two of some narrative nonfiction book talks. These are all books from our eRead Illinois account. And if you need to know how to use that, there are other tutorials for that. These books are all print ebooks that you read on your screen. They are not audiobooks to listen to. So with that in mind, let's get started. The first one is a historical book. It's called Boundaries: How the Mason-Dixon Line Settled a Family Feud and Divided a Nation. This was written by Sally Walker. She's one of my favorite narrative nonfiction writers. She always makes everything interesting. But in this book, she's pointing out that we live in a world of boundaries: geographic boundaries, scientific boundaries, cultural boundaries, religious. And one of America's most enduring boundaries is the Mason-Dixon line, and it's most associated with the divide between the North and the South, and the right to freedom for all people. This book traces the history of this line through family feuds, brave exploration, scientific excellence, and the struggles to define our country. Try it out. The next book is called Earthrise: My Adventures as an Apollo 14 Astronaut. Of the nearly 7 billion people who live on Earth, only 12 have walked on the moon, and Dr. Edgar Mitchell was one of them. He was the sixth. This book focuses on Edgar's amazing journey to the moon in 1971, and it highlights the many steps that he took to get there, including how he grew up as a farm boy on a ranch. He lived in Roswell, New Mexico during the UFO crash. He graduated from Carnegie Mellon and MIT. He became a Navy combat pilot and finally a NASA astronaut. And in the book, he talks about his historic flight to the moon, and he describes everything from the very practical things like eating and sleeping and going to the bathroom in space to the metaphysical, such as the life-changing sensation of connectedness to the universe that he felt, and that other astronauts have described. This is a great biography for space buffs. Just super, super interesting. I think you'll like it. The next book is called The Bronte Sisters: The Brief Lives of Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. Um, in case you've never heard of them, the Bronte sisters are among the most beloved writers of all time. They're best known for their classic 19th century novels like Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Agnes Grey. And this biography begins with the Brontes' move to a village called Haworth, and it follows the story of the three sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, as well as their brother Branwell, through their childhoods until the death of all four of the siblings. And this biography it reads like a novel with just little stories about each sister, and all of the facts were taken from letters and diary entries and some of their own fictional writing, as well as from the people that they encountered in their lives. So it's a really fascinating look at some very famous literary figures. This next book is called Flesh and Blood So Cheap. On March 25th, 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City burst into flames. The factory was crowded, and the doors were locked to ensure that the workers stayed inside, so the people couldn't escape. 146 people, mostly women, perished, and it was one of the most lethal workplace fires in American history. But the story of the fire is not just the story of one accident in time. It's the story of immigration and hard work that people had to put in to make it in a new country as they traveled to America to find a better life. And it's the story of really poor working conditions and greedy bosses as garment workers discovered the endless sacrifices that were required to make ends meet. It is a story of this unimaginable and horrible, avoidable disaster. But it's also the story of pride and activism and those fearless immigrants and women who stood up to big business and got America on their side. And they finally changed working conditions for our entire nation. And they created a lot of the radical new laws that we take for granted today and that make sure that we are safe in our jobs. So give this book a try. Hey, here's a sports book. Outcasts United is the extraordinary tale of a refugee youth soccer team and how it transformed a small town called Clarkston, Georgia. So Clarkston had been designated a refugee settlement center in the 1990s, and it sort of became the first American home for many, many families who were escaping the world's worst war zones, from Liberia and Sudan to Iraq and Afghanistan. Suddenly, ordinary little Clarkston streets were filled with all of these kids of all different colors and nations, and they were playing soccer in any open space they could find. And so these kids named themselves the Fugees. And this book follows a pivotal season in the life of the Fugees and their charismatic coach. So if you like those uplifting, victorious sports stories, then this book is for you. Our next book is called Master of Deceit, J. Edgar Hoover and America in the Age of Lies. What is the price of security? Well, J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in America. So the question is, was Hoover a protector of America or a betrayer of its principles? This book unmasks the man behind the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, talks about his tangled family history and his personal relationships and his own need for secrecy, deceit, and control. It also talks about some broad trends in American society that shaped the world back in those days. Hoover may have given America the security it wanted, but the secrets that he knew gave him and the FBI all the power he wanted. People in power telling big lies is not new, so check out this piece of history. Sometimes you just want a story that's super uplifting, and that's what this one is. It's called A Girl Named Faithful Plum, the true story of a dancer from China and how she achieved her dream. And she really struggled. In 1977, when Mei Li was 11 years old, she learned that the famous Beijing Dance Academy was having open auditions. And she had already taken dance lessons, but everybody was telling her that a poor country girl could just never get into the academy, especially because she didn't have any connections. But Mei, whose name means faithful plum, persisted, and eventually she beat out 60,000 other girls to get one of the 12 coveted spots. But she soon learned that getting in was easy compared to staying in. Without those all important connections, she was just a little girl on her own, far away from her family. But she had determination and talent and sheer force of will. And that was not something that her teachers or the other students expected. And pretty soon it was pretty apparent that Zanmi was not to be underestimated. So this is a fabulous true story of rising above your expectations to achieve fame and fortune. Sometimes American history is really dark, and we just kind of can't believe how far we've come. This is one of those books that's going to let you look into the past. Spies of the Mississippi, the true story of the spy network that tried to destroy the civil rights movement. This is the true story of how state spies tried to block voting rights for African Americans during the civil rights era. And during that civil rights movement, the state of Mississippi actually created this elaborate spy network. And the network's mission was to preserve segregation by any means necessary, including voter interference, sponsorship of white supremacy groups, and even murder. So this is a twisty tale, and I think you'll enjoy this little slice of history. Speaking of American history being dark, our next book is called Horrors of Andersonville, Life and Death Inside a Civil War Prison. And it is dark. But I want to read it because I actually had an ancestor who survived Andersonville. This is a Confederate prison that existed for only the last 14 months of the Civil War, but it has a well-documented legacy of horror. And that has lived on in the diaries of the prisoners and transcripts of the trial of its commander. The diaries describe appalling conditions. Vermin infested men were crowded into open stockades with a single polluted stream as their only water source. And food was very scarce, and medical supplies were virtually non existent. And the bodies of those who did not survive each night had to be cleared away each morning. Andersonville was designed to house about 10,000 Yankee prisoners, but in August 1864, there were 32,000 there. Nearly a third of the prisoners perished. So I'm really lucky that my ancestor made it out alive. Exposure, starvation, and disease were the main causes, but excessive harsh penal practices and even violence amongst the men contributed to that unprecedented death rate. By the end of the war, outraged Northerners demanded retribution for this travesty, and they received it in the form of the trial and subsequent hanging of Captain Henry Wurz, the prisoners' commandant. So, if you like a military story, military history, this one will educate you about the horrors of war. Okay, I'm going to end on a much more uplifting note because some books are like a really great documentary. And this book called The Quest for the Tree Kangaroo is like that. And it's short, too. A tree kangaroo looks like a bear, but it isn't one. It climbs trees as easily as a monkey, but it isn't a monkey either. It has a belly pocket like a kangaroo, but what's a kangaroo doing up in a tree? In this book, you'll meet the amazing Matchie's tree kangaroo, who makes its home in the ancient trees of Papua New Guinea in the cloud forest. And you'll also meet the really amazing scientists who track these animals. So if you like scientific documentaries, National Geographic Channel, you'll like this book. Happy reading!